Hi everyone, welcome to Keith Morris's workshop, Growing Fruits and Nuts, 20 Years of Tree Crop Trials in the North Country. We're looking forward to diving into this exciting topic. And before we get started, I'd like to quickly go over the workshop format. I'm Laura Andrews, Office Assistant for NOFA New Hampshire, and I'll be moderating this session with fellow NOFA staff members Nikki and Chadley. And we have our board president, Laura Hartz, with us as well. We're asking everyone to please keep yourselves muted during the workshop and to type your questions into the chat box throughout the discussion. We will read out your questions at the end. Keith may address them along the way as well. And also please note that we're recording this meeting and all workshop sessions, which will become available to you after the conference. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Keith Morris of Willow Crossing Farm.
Hello. Oh, I've lost my mouse again. There we go. Okay. Hi, folks. How's it going? Is everybody able to hear me okay? Maybe just wave if you can. Okay, great. So yeah, it's a pleasure. Thanks to everyone at NOFA New Hampshire. It's always great to be a part of this conference. I do miss seeing everyone in person. Today I'm going to share about some of our trials and research with tree crops in particular, but we'll start with an overview of my whole farm and just some of the things that we've been doing. My farm is in northern Vermont in the Lamoille River Valley, right on the valley floor. I'm in the wrong slideshow, so I apologize for that. You folks get to see everything because I set it up for that. So, a couple technical difficulties. I did lose my chat window, but yeah, so here we are. This is what the farm looked like as I started. Long story short, I actually started my farm with a rent-to-own process, which was really interesting. And it's kind of another topic for another time, but it's been definitely a big part of what we're doing in terms of like accessing our land without debt, or a part of like our tree crop trials as well has been a lot of our own propagation, a lot of our own grafting, a lot of our own seed collection, in addition, of course, to buying in rootstock and buying in nursery plants and things like that. But we're definitely a very budget conscious operation. And it's great to see, folks with access to funds diving into this, but it's certainly a factor in our research and trials in essentially being from our infrastructure to our plant collection. So briefly, what we're seeing on the screen as I'm going through is a little time lapse. This farm is extremely subject to erosion and flooding. You can see we're literally right in the valley floor. And we're also kind of getting a time lapse of my infrastructure development. Again, this budgetless and debt-free. And budgetless, some people think that means like, oh, we have all the money in the world. It means like we literally just like cut down trees, building materials. And of course, money is involved. As far as our farm enterprise, I think this is an important disclosure at the beginning. We are an educational farm. We run a wide variety of events. One of my primary income streams from the farm at this time is as a plant nursery. And as a plant nursery, it really changes a lot of the economics around some of these plants. Do today is be fully transparent with both success and failures. And there's a lot of crops, a lot of tree crops that have a lot of promise, that have a lot of potential, but I certainly wouldn't put all my eggs in those baskets, so to speak, as income crops. And again, just from the beginning, I'll really advocate for diversity. We're going to look at tree crops as supplements and complements to existing pasture operations, existing and grazing, really a number of other enterprises that may be going on a farm, and rather than strictly tree crops, although we'll certainly look at some of the potential for these systems, some of these species in orchard systems or more commercial oriented operations for the crops themselves. But I definitely think it's important to note that, you know, when we grow plums, apples, cherries, pears, apricots, kiwis, peaches, figs, hazelnuts, pine nuts, walnuts, butternuts, these as crops themselves, really significant part of our bottom line in terms of, you know, paying the bills. And that's, you know, something I think that it is important that I be frank with, because some of them have that potential and some of them are so hit or miss that, you know, while it's great to enjoy them, I'm not really counting on them as a significant part of our enterprise and as crops themselves. So I'm just kind of blowing through some of these slides, but subject to regular flooding. We are in both a 100-year and 500-year floodplain. And for folks who maybe aren't as familiar with those phrases, neither means they only happen every 100 years or every 500 years. And certainly in the valley floor, we're increasingly aware of volatile weather patterns and not only volatile weather patterns, but also upland flashier watershed. So every time that someone paves a parking lot, or every so many more acres of roofs that go in up watershed from us, means that much more immediate impact of a rain event rather than like absorption through the forest floor. And in fact, it's a major difference in flooding is whether the ground is frozen, for instance, ice, of course, and ice dams and how the ice breaks, and, you know, and evapotranspiration when trees are in leaf. Those trees are literally pumping water into the atmosphere 24/7, and dramatically less flood prone, even with significant rain events that would put us underwater with frozen ground, or even dormant trees with not frozen ground. So all of these are parts of why we're advocates of tree crops. And especially for those of you who are in floodplains, the resilience lent by tree crops. Map of my farm here, and you can see one of the main focuses of where we've aggressively reforested what was once an entirely bare hayfield has been on those water's edge. And riparian production is an interesting thing because some of you may be a part of CREP or familiar with programs like CREP, the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program. It's a federally funded program that basically pays you to take riverside land out of production. And the of conservation that believe that, you know, no human presence is maybe best, and that's certainly an appropriate response to people, you know, growing corn right over the edges of the river or grazing their animals down into, you know, over the banks. But we, while working with some of those programs and seeing the benefits of those programs that incentivize reforesting the water's edge, those programs also prohibit production. So they're actually working with some of these farm assistance programs to kind of broaden their horizons to this idea of productive habitat, where we can have, you know, healthy forest that serves purposes of, you know, evapotranspiration, of bank stabilization, of erosion prevention, of water quality and nutrient absorption, of shading the streams for fish habitat. All these reasons that we want to have trees along our waterways while using productive and, you know, berries and fruits and things like that. Also, of course, some of you are probably familiar in 2015 2015, 2011, I can't even remember now. But of course, we in Vermont were subject to the Irene superstorm, which put like every valley floor farm underwater. Some folks had all of their topsoil washed away to bedrock. Most farms have a significant amount of infrastructure damage, and our plantings and tree crops were proven by that test in a number of reasons. One, crops that were subject to inundation, being flooded, squash, pumpkins, peppers, tomatoes, that were underwater were deemed unsaleable because of when we have these types of major flood events, we also have all of our municipal sewer systems failing, and that contaminated wastewater in the flood basically renders the people who weren't physically destroyed or didn't physically lose their crops had to destroy them and deem them unsaleable and just throw them into compost piles. But with the elderberries and hazelnuts and things that were totally above the flood water, they were essentially deemed safe and saleable. So that's something that's actually, for better or worse, I mean, we certainly don't want to celebrate the destruction that storms like this bring. It also brought a lot of attention to our work and brought a lot of interest to things like, we're just watching our last herbal presentation, saw that kind of in a central role in an immune system plant, as well as an important native plant, where the market is very hungry for elderberries and organic elderberries. So just getting into a little more detail, I'm leaving this up, feel free to dive in if you want, but I'm gonna move past some of these maps. I just wanted to kind of give you context, and to further do so, let's see if I can get out of this and just briefly give you kind of like our most, in terms of aerial photography. So we do have, a 30 by 96 high tunnel. Are you guys able to see my mouse on the screen? Maybe some thumbs up from other moderators if you can see the little hand moving. You can. Okay, great. So this is a 30 by 96 high tunnel that was actually manufactured in New Hampshire. It is on wheels and tracks, and you can see where we're cover cropping outside of the high tunnel. This whole high tunnel slides back and forth, basically doubling our area in coverage and allowing us to do things like very low value cover crops in our high value production. Is our classroom and a production scale kitchen where we host events and farm dining. This is an herbal labyrinth. It's a 7-circuit, meditative labyrinth. This is my former partner's on-farm apothecary. She's a clinical herbalist and does like client consultations. Her apothecary is based in the town, but then also has some clients come to the farm. And then basically a bunch of buildings that in this have never been completed. We're kind of getting there. One of our most recent endeavors is a bunch of solar panels that actually do produce more power than we consume. And then you can maybe see also a geodesic stage and band shell. So you can see we got a lot of enterprises growing. These are all hazelnuts. These are all riparian buffer production species. That time lapse, you can see this was totally bare. This is some of our worst erosion. So these are some of the areas where we've really aggressively reforested. I'm going to reset my tilt and compass. And then basically this kind of more intensive zone, and this is part of the farm as well. And you can see, even though we've been doing a lot of planting along these other riverbanks, it's really interesting, like the way that human energy works as a benevolent force on a farm, of course, in terms of weeding, watering, and maintaining trees. That hands-off conservation model, where if we're engaged in environmentally destructive actions on our farm, hands off or do nothing is maybe better than actively impacting ecosystems for the negative. But we're big advocates of like ecologic regeneration and participatory ecology, where that human element is actually a force for ecologic regeneration, whether it's planting trees, pruning trees, even cutting trees down as appropriate. And, also, of course, our irrigation has a major impact. One thing counterintuitively, a lot of people think, okay, you're in the floodplain, so maybe you have hydric soils or water tolerant species. And yes, occasionally during these 100 and 500-year floods, which I mentioned, they happen more frequently. Just to explicitly state, we've had 4 500-year floods in just the past 5 years. And we expect that we'll see that with increasing regularity and frequency due to both upland development and these increasing frequency of. That said, while these plants may be subject to occasional inundation by flooding, we're actually on, if anything, excessively drained sandy soils. When we drilled our well, I had to drill 133 feet through sand with casing before we got to any stone. So when it floods, it literally percolates like a wave on the beach where that out, and this flood water that's over our farm field looks like it's boiling because there's 133 feet of airspace that water is literally cascading through. So that's another reason why, like when we look at watershed-wide planting, these pervious soils, healthy deep soils, are actually reducing the flashiness and the impact of floods downstream. Okay, I'm going to go back to my
Keith?
Slides that we're not going to spend too much time at. This is Mark Shepard's farm in Wisconsin, just one example of how tree crops can work, in fact, in a number of different ways. Without going too in depth with the variety of agroforestry potentials, I'll just look, at alley cropping, which is, when we do much like our conventional annual production row crop systems within rows of trees. And in the case of like Mark Shepard's farm that we're looking at,
Keith?
what they were doing is when they established these trees, they might have, 7 rows of vegetable production or other annual production. And then as those trees matured, moved down to 5. And then as they matured even more, moved down to 3. And then they're, depending on your management and your goals, if you're very interested in what's growing in the alley, then you start thinning your trees or, changing to more shade tolerant crops, which is a nice model for those of you who are interested in this really rapidly growing market. In fact, shade and, shade is a very big asset to some of these most valuable herbal plants.
Keith,
but if you want to
hear me?
Sun, I can.
Hi, this is Nikki from NOFA. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
The video, we can hear you very well, but it is kind of freezing a little bit.
I see.
When you're talking. So we were going to suggest if you might be able to turn off your video, that might help.
Probably can do that.
Okay, thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
Invisible mouse for whatever reason, but it.
And thanks everyone while we do some support.
I'm just going to go to the next. I'm just going to run through some of these. Well, sorry, let's go back. So I have an invisible mouse and thus cannot find where, here we go. Get back to my Zoom.
And we can stop your video if you need help.
Yeah, I got
it. Good job.
Does that stop my screen sharing or no?
No, just your personal video.
Okay. Great.
I
yeah,
can
you
still see your
didn't need to see me anyway, and now I'm that much less self-conscious. So, okay. And then, of course, Silvopasture is another option for how we bring trees into a production-oriented farm. And we do find that, depending on any number of factors in terms of what you're grazing, what your existing pasture quality is, does have, if well designed, the potential to actually increase feed conversion, right? We find that when animals have access to shade in the summer and windbreak in the winter, that they're actually consuming less fodder while seeing similar, gains. This is not really relevant, but of course, we've got lots of this is great stuff that I'll skip. So I will look at this one for just a minute. I guess it's important to note that my farm design, and my perspective as a farm designer when working on other farms does come from the practice of permaculture design. And thus we're looking at the integrated systems and how all of the parts are connected and benefiting each other as much as possible. And that tree crops can play in our farms is actually producing fertility. And in fact, it's crucial. And we have most of our agroforestry trials and studies are really coming from more tropical places. It's a much more established and existing viable commercial model. Of course, when we look at things like bananas and coconuts and, all of these tropical tree crops, chocolate, etc. And that is in the form of mulches and compost feedstocks, but also in terms of nitrogen fixation is crucial. In fact, the studies indicate that up to 80% of our canopy in an agroforestry system should be geared towards fertility production. Now, at first, that might sound at an incredible cost to production if we're devoting 80% of our canopy to fertility production. But fortunately, there are all sorts. They have other crops and yields worth growing in addition to nitrogen fixation or dynamic accumulation. And without going too deep into it, dynamic accumulation refers to these micronutrients and minerals that are typically brought from subsoils that shallow-rooted annual plants have less access to. And even, maple trees, and for folks who, maybe take maple leaf litter in the fall as top dressing for your asparagus or mulching your garden bed, phenomenon of dynamic accumulation. Maple trees are, bringing subsoil nutrients that are lost in that immediate topsoil cycle of growth and decay as things essentially leach through to lower layers of soil. So as a pattern, these are typically very deep-rooted plants. But comfrey is another one of our classic dynamic accumulators, and even things like dandelion, which again, it's really interesting to look at dandelion. Herb, historic weed, historic problem, and then folks, you'll go to places like Zach Woods, one of the larger commercial herb farms here in Vermont, and they have literal row crops of dandelion where they're weeding the things around the dandelion plants, and it's incredibly lucrative as well for them with knowing markets. And it's not, that's a whole other conversation. But anyway, diversity is again our friend in this. Of course, in certain host predatory and parasitic insects, and this is again where these types of systems can really benefit being adjacent to conventional organic agriculture or annual production. And then I have on this slide resource partitioning, which is just very carefully thinking about those factors, maybe first and foremost, such as shade and how trees might shade other crops. And that's where we end up with these classic patterns of resource partitioning underground, again, looking at these like deep tap-rooted plants and then surface feeding roots, and how we keep things in the most mutually beneficial and cooperative relationships rather than creating stress or competition between our elements. So getting back to willow crossing and looking at some of our plants, we're a big fan of native plants. we'll sort of start this conversation with some of our native plants. In this Lamoille Valley floodplain, the key canopy species historically, for those of you who are familiar with the butternut or the white walnut, it is an incredible, valuable plant for all sorts of reasons, was crucially important to native Vermonters and New Hampshires, and early settlers. And in fact, before pecan groves exploded in the southeast and south of the United States, the butternut and the butternut pie was a staple in Vermont's kitchens. This is where analog, and I'm doing air quotes here, but you guys can't see it because my video's off. But ecologic analogs are basically looking at our native species as indicators of what closely related crop species might do well in these niches. So while we're big fans of butternuts, it's worth noting the butternut is an endangered species and subject to a fungal blight. In my opinion, that's all the more of the butternuts, but it's also an asterisk next to, you know, putting all of your nuts in one basket, so to speak, and banking on something like just the butternut. So our closest related and similarly native, although not as nearly common in my part of Vermont, is the black walnut. Black walnut, of course, is a very valuable nut, very high in fat, very high in protein. These are some of the highest fat and protein plant foods that we can grow in this part of the world, but also exceptionally valuable for their lumber. In fact, in the Midwest, people drive around in cars, find big old black walnuts, and come back at night with helicopters and steal them because a single tree will sell for over $50,000 when processed as a veneer. And so, you know, yes, that's a time factor, but it's also a part of hopefully our farm planning is, we could say, you know, quote unquote, this intergenerational perspective. But frankly, I mean, you have these able to be harvested potentially. Some folks are planting them at like twice the optimal end density and then thinning out. And that's also a good idea because while they're large, they're somewhat slow to establish. And so you can have that earlier production in with more trees. And then if they start to crowd out, or as you need more sun or space for silvopasture or alley cropping, then thin out. It's important to note the allopathic properties of the black walnut in particular, although I definitely find that tends to be overstated. I mean, you look at a black walnut in the woods and they're typically not like killing all the plants around them. Your annual production in terms of especially potatoes, tomatoes, and other solanaceous plants. That said, some of the other plants that we'll look at in a little bit, like currants and all your ribes, gooseberries, yosterberries, things like that, are very jug loam tolerant. The hazelnuts are very jug loam tolerant. And in terms of pasture, there are actually deworming properties in that jug loam as well that is both used for humans and herbal medicine. Guidance and research is something that people are doing as a substitute for veterinary dewormers in horses and sheep in particular. So further down the train of the ecologic analog, we also have other juglans, such as the juglans regia. The king walnut is literally its Latin name, and that is also known as the Carpathian walnut. And that is mostly what you're going to eat if you buy your walnuts in a bag at the supermarket. They're coming from one, especially with climate change, that's increasingly possible. That said, where I am in very far northern Vermont, you know, they're not doing that well. I'd say 1 out of every 10 are even surviving, and this is the juglans regia, the Carpathian walnut. But even if you're more comfortably a zone 5, southern New Hampshire, seacoast area, the Connecticut River Valley, they're certainly worth trying and definitely your most valuable in terms of like conventional walnut look and appearance and shell cracking large nuts inside. Then in Arcaria, those are all of your hickories, the shagbark hickory being probably the most promising as a food crop, and then the pecan, of course. And people are like, well, you grow pecans in Vermont? And we do. It's another one, it's more experimental, and the trees are surviving well. Whether we'll see significant yields of that crop remains to be seen. It's definitely clearly experimental. That said, the and hundreds of years. And when we look at how much climate's changed in just the past few decades, I think we might wish that we planted more things like some of the marginally hardy species, so that they're established and prepared. In fact, that's where I'm going to skip this, but we will look at this. Here is their hardiness map. You can see northern Vermont, northern New Hampshire has that zone 3, the dark purple, historic 4, that brighter purple, where just the lowest reaches, Seacoast, Connecticut Valley are zone 5. When we compile the past 20 years, now 30 years since 1990, this map was made in 2006. It's actually even more extreme in the past 14 years. So this map is just looking at 15 years of climate change. It has gotten even more extreme. I'll see if I can find a newer up. Zone 3 is almost entirely gone from all but like the Canadian parts of New Hampshire, and zone 5 has comfortably moved within like the entire southern half of both New Hampshire and Vermont. That's something that I also present with a bit of an asterisk, because I don't want to say, hey, you know, climate change, let's like plant peaches, figs, palm trees. You know, the reality of climate change is not a consistent, gradual, uniform, or benign, better or much more accurately understood as global storming, more so than global warming or climate chaos or climate collapse, right? And that's the reality of like the slipping jet stream, and what we're seeing, of course, with this thermal vortex phenomenon, which actually does come in midwinter and like totally kill things like peaches and zone, you know, historically zone 5 type plants. So that's again in favor of diversity, in favor of not putting all your eggs. Tree crops start making a lot of sense at the same time, not only due to their potential for carbon sequestration, but as opposed to annuals, where basically you need to have that income pay back the expense every single year. You're basically putting all your chips on the table, so to speak, to use a gambling metaphor. In the case of tree crops, other than these test winters that actually kill our trees, even if we don't set or ripening every year, we have the work of planting and implementation done once, and all that expense done once for potentially decades or even centuries of return on investment. So here we're looking at climate forecasts for New Hampshire, and you know, with aggressive emissions reductions, we still see New Hampshire projected to behave as Virginia. And without emissions reductions, we see. So again, I don't want to say like, oh, let's all get out there and just plant peaches, but I definitely think this is a major factor to incorporate in long-term farm planning, especially when we see, you know, changes in the length and duration of winters, the problems that poses for what pests survive and how pests survive, and you know, again, climate destabilization, the potential for drought or flood or any number of aberrant, all that we can, you know, I'm wary of anyone who issues these types of forecasts with any confidence in terms of what the weather will look like in the future. But I can say with some confidence that one thing we can count on is unraveling patterns and things just not being as they have been historically. So yeah, we got our pecans, we got our nut shakers. The real reason I'm a nut tree advocate is because I secretly just wanted, that's the machine that we're seeing. That's a means of harvest in the South, where this is a major crop. And I don't want to spend too much time with this, but of course these trees are of ancient and significant importance all over the world. Juglans, the family name, literally means Jovis glans, basically Jupiter's balls, God's nuts. And then of course, Caria is the nut goddess. So we have some gender equality in our divinity. And in which are pillars shaped like women, are called in architecture caryatids. And this is where, you know, I need to be transparent when I'm straight making things up. I believe that comes from the nut goddess Caria, and these were historically carved from nut trees and temples created for devotion to the nut goddess. And then as they started building in stone, they continued to call them by the name Caria. And today we call them caryatids, but I've never in any way found like any real evidence of that. It's just a strange coincidence that I believe in. When we looked at that map, you might see that it fits almost exactly with the historic range of the American chestnut, which again, when we looked at that climate map, the zone hardiness map, you can see where those little squeaks of historic zone 5 into New Hampshire and Vermont are where the only places where the American chestnut survived historically here. So in my opinion, it's a safe bet to imagine that the forecast only better in terms of the type of climate for this tree. That said, folks like the American Chestnut Foundation, who are looking to restore the American chestnut, are doing very well-intentioned work to get these timber type American chestnut genetics back into our landscapes. From a nut production standpoint, however, these timber type American chestnuts are probably not as promising as crops as some of our hybrid Chinese, which is what they're doing to restore. The American Chestnut Foundation is selecting for American chestnut traits at the minimum of expression of the Chinese hybrids, but for earlier bearing and most production and like a multi-stemmed tree that tops out at like 12 to 15 feet laden with nuts, we have a whole different host of hybrids. And again, that depends on your goals and it depends on your context. If you have American chestnuts, it's probably best not to work with a lot of wild hybrids from other continents because you probably have something of incredible importance genetically in your existing surviving American chestnuts. That said, the hybrids have been around and being planted since the 70s, and most people that imagine they have healthy surviving American chestnuts are typically discovered upon actual genetic analysis to have at least some aspect of cross-pollination and hybridization with some chestnuts. The Japanese chestnut hybrids and the European chestnut hybrids I find are nowhere near as hardy, but certainly worth experimenting with again in those, you know, historical zone 5s, seacoast, warmer microclimates, and Connecticut Valley and the southern ends of the state. The last one we'll look at with nuts is the hazelnut. I'll end with this one because it's definitely the one I see the most promise for as a commercial to bear in terms of, you know, you can plant hazelnuts and see your first nuts in 3 years and see significant yields of nuts in 5 years and see, nearing maximum production as early as 7 years from planting. A lot of breeding is happening with these almost entirely in Oregon. Oregon's a major producer of hazelnuts. where they are not operating in the context of the Eastern Filbert blight. So of course we have, they're great and worthy species, both the beaked hazel and the American hazel. That said, from a nut production standpoint, we're typically hybridizing them with European filberts, and thus you'll commonly hear them called Phil hazels or Hazelberts, indicating that hybridization. The Oregon State University has released quote unquote filbert blight immune hazels or filberts, truly European, and they didn't cut it in the context of the East, where we're the native habitat for the filbert blight. Not putting them through, to call them immune, it seems like an overstatement, but it's certainly worth experimenting with. I don't know if we want to spend much time with this stuff, but again, you know, deeply ancient, revered, magical plants. The salmon of knowledge got its wisdom of the ages by eating from the hazelnuts that draped over its pool. And then there's this whole story about Finn McCool and the salmon of knowledge that is pretty cool, but I'll skip. It is a Betulaceae species. So it's a birch family, same family as all birches. It has the male flowers in a catkin, and then the female flowers in these tiny fuchsia, hot pink little pistils that come out of the terminal buds. Beautiful to observe. And one of the first flowers you'll see, like March, April, snow on the ground. You'll see these, once the catkins start to open, which is very obvious, go closer. And you don't really need a hand lens, but if you with a hand lens, a lot of potential, and also very versatile, super hardy, tolerant of a wide range of soils, able to be, you know, beaten by flotsam and icebergs and things like that in this floodplain context. And then I said the hazel was the last, but I'll just briefly mention the pine nut, another ecologic analog. Our native pines do not produce nuts worthy of consumption by human beings. Every species on this list is a hardy edible pine. That said, many of these, like Pinus edulis, which you see the pinyon pine in the Southwest, is marginally hardy and questionably going to survive. However, Corianus, the Korean stone pine, is almost every pine nut that you see in the supermarket, now grown commercially in China and exported to the world from there. That's proven hardy to the farthest cold reaches of New Hampshire and Vermont. Pinus siberica, which are probably two subspecies ecotypes of the same species, and that's our classic northern Italian Swiss stone pine that's native to the European Alps. Is another one that's proven hardy for us. Very slow to bear, although there are also dwarf pines traditionally grown for ornamental purposes that have delicious edible pine nuts. And that's something we're just starting to experiment with and really excited about because they're much sooner to bear. Last, rhizal associations that happen in the root zones with fungi are not the same as our native pines. So for that reason, people are working on two fronts. One being inoculation of pine nut mycorrhizae, which folks like Grimo's Nursery out of Ontario produce and bag and sell, or grafting, where we can take nut pines and graft them onto white pine rootstock. So we grow our white pines, all of our native mycorrhizae, all of that fungal mycosphere is native, intact, and healthy. Pines just above the graft. So that's pretty promising. And actually in New Hampshire, Doug Clayton, a real old school grower there in Jaffrey, New Hampshire, has probably got some of the oldest grafted pine nuts that I've ever seen. Going to skip some of these. We'll look at the pawpaw, of incredible promise as the largest fruit native to North America. An incredible story to this plant. Basically, survivor of a pre-glacial North America that's a very tropical plant. In fact, everything else in the genus is, in the Florida Keys or in the Caribbean islands. And these plants, native to the Southeast, have been carried by native people to Ohio, to Pennsylvania, to parts of Western New York, to even Ontario. And we're experimenting with them into New Hampshire and Vermont. Another one that's like one of those zone 5 experiments. If you're like historically a zone 3, you can grow these, they will survive, but you probably won't have all of the ones that you plant survive. And that said, they're very finicky in terms of transplanting. So I think a lot of people have failure, not necessarily due to the lack of hardiness of this plant, but it's a plant unlike apples that have been dug and shipped in the mail for centuries and, kind of bred for that type, or naturally inclined to that type of being bare rooted and moved around and handled. Dug up and moved around and transplanted. But once established, they sucker and you can have a whole grove from a single one. And, the fruit is a banana, vanilla, mango, pineapple-y type of just incredible tropical fruit, a lot of medicinal potential. It's destroying cancer in trials with the ananaceous compounds. It's the family Ananaceae. And, again, has a me and my farm, none has ever fruited, but we produce them as nursery plants. And even in my house is downtown, just about the same climate as my farm, a few miles down the street. And there's all these buildings and sidewalks and a lot more streets and paved parking lots. And the pawpaws do better, even just in that minor microclimatic difference. And then as you move from my farm down towards the Champlain Valley into Burlington, we do see pawpaws surviving and fruiting pretty regularly now. Climates, they're certainly worth trying. And even potentially investing in more significantly, but count on some failure just due to their resenting of being transplanted. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because it's not really a fruit or a nut, but it is worth noting when we mention that idea of producing fertility with tree crops. The Black Locust is a significant nitrogen fixing, a traditional, has the nitrogen fixation properties of a bean, and it has a role on our farms due to its incredible rot resistance, its incredible high speed of growth. I mean, I had like bundles of nursery plants that I just like threw in a compost pile, reached 20 feet when I didn't transplant them out, like within 2 years, In fact, you see these historically next to all these old barns and homesteads. And I often wondered, was this because they knew that they made absolutely rot resistant, the highest BTU firewoods? Obviously, these early developed homesteads were aware of these properties, but it turns out, I've more recently learned, they were grown as lightning rods because they were the only thing that could get taller than the barn by the time you finished building the barn. These plants would already be over them. The bean pods on the Black Locust are toxic. For anybody tuning in from Massachusetts, they're also a native plant, but that's a whole other story. We maybe will touch on that a little bit, but not right now. That said, these flowers that we're looking at on the left are just incredibly delicious, and one of the major treats of early spring, just to eat them raw. They taste better than pea greens or pea shoots. They taste like little sprouts of peas with nectar, and they're majorly important bee fodder as well. The kiwi is reluctant to share how successful the kiwi are for us because I mentioned we mostly are engaged in nursery production of most of these plants, less so than the fruit or nut production themselves. The kiwis are ones that we are planting at commercial scale in terms of, commercial vineyards. And it's interesting because I did that a while ago and didn't have a lot, like not setting up irrigation and getting them through those first few years. They can be a little finicky getting established, but once established, your risk lies on the other end. They are incredibly vigorous. And in fact, again, in Massachusetts, they are not yet illegal, but there's a lot of talk about making kiwis illegal in Massachusetts due to their potential opportunistic, quote unquote, invasive behavior. That said, I have seen, a kiwi kind of edge of a wood. But in our production systems, they are best producing fruit when they're very well managed and very well pruned. And I don't see them, they're expansive as individual plants. They're incredibly vigorous. The vines will grow indefinitely and swallow like this fire escape that we see in the photograph, but they're not dispersive, and we don't see them and pooping the seeds and spreading them all over. And they are, maybe 50 times the amount of vitamin C that we find in lemons and limes. And I think it's really, nobody's talking about like making growing oranges in Florida illegal, where they continue to like use an incredible chemical arsenal and fill the Everglades and drain the Everglades while we drink orange juice as a normal thing every morning. We could, I think if we were weighing the impact of our vitamin C consumption between and a few crazy kiwis in the Northeast, I would rather see a few wild kiwis in the Northeast. They are dioecious. That means, although they're not truly dioecious, but they appear and behave as dioecious, meaning two houses, meaning male and female flowers typically on separate plants. So only the female flowers make the fruit, and only so typically you only need one male for every 8 female, depending on the way your orchard or vineyard is laid out. And that's also another thing in terms of their vigor and their ability to climb buildings or trees. You can have the males go wild and be unpruned because you're not trying to get the fruit off them, and be adjacent to females, and then have your maximized production be females on your maintained trellis. Oregon State has got some of the best research and kind of folks doing production in kiwis. Granted, they're in a very different climate than we are, but great data. I actually meant to pull some pictures from their PDF, but I apologize, I didn't. But they just have some really good schematics in terms of like best trellis design and best pruning for fruit, and they're fruiting on their second year wood, so how you prune them is important. And you definitely do want to prune them. You can see, if anybody's familiar with them or tried them, most people who fruit say the number one reason is people either lost track of whether they were planting males and females, whether they even had a male survive. Sometimes you plant like 4 kiwis and one doesn't survive, and you're like, oh well, whatever, but like that was your only pollinator. And then also we look at this photograph on the right side of the screen, and that's not your optimal fruit production, right? You really want a lot of air and light. You want a lot of same thing with the pawpaws. I have them kiwis growing in my house downtown, Jeffersonville, Vermont, 5 miles away, more or less the same climate as my farm, but I'm surrounded by buildings and on a fence, and like with reflective roads and all these heat traps and things around them, exponentially more productive. So they're going to do better with, protected microclimates, windbreaks, and again, a lot of management, a lot of pruning, a lot of air and light. And you're going to want to get established. Once they're established, that you couldn't kill them if you wanted, which is a reason to be careful with where you plant them. And that kind of brings us back to the beginning of the whole conversation, looking at my farm plan, which is to say, like, all these species, you know, typically my experience is farmers are doing incredibly good research about things like how we design the trellis, or ratios from male to females, or which varieties we're growing, but not as much careful thought and planning as to where a vineyard might work on the whole farm as an organism. And I'd say that's probably one of the tree crops, is really doing that type of master planning, especially if you're still grazing or doing annual vegetable production, or looking at, you know, expanding your irrigation. All of these things are kind of overlays that we want to map out and really carefully plan, like that organismic level of our farm before we, you know, because I've seen folks do so much time and energy and research into getting just the right trellis construction, just the right varieties, just the right ratio on parts of the farm that don't really make sense, whether they don't get adequate attention, or they're exposed to cold weather, or they're a frost pocket, or just maintenance becomes such a chore because they're out of the way or out of sight and out of mind. How are we doing time-wise, moderators?
We might want to start switching over to questions.
Okay, great. Yeah. So fruits, I guess I'll just briefly show us the elderberry, another native, major promise. A lot of named cultivars out there. Some of our wild, and some of the named cultivars out there. It's not a one that a lot of research has been done, kind of skipped a generation. It's a crucially important plant to indigenous peoples, a crucially important plant to early settlers, and then we sort of forgot about it. And now in just the past, like maybe 15, 20 years, the elderberries kind of come back in the popularity of herbal medicine, combined with increasing compound named from the genus of this plant that combats cold virus. Not a raw fruit, not a dessert fruit, in fact, contains cyanide. And so while they can taste really good raw, and I like to eat a few really good raw, they're really meant to be made into syrup or wine or otherwise cooked. Our ribes, great when we're looking at these combined systems, very shade tolerant, not truly native, but naturalized. And you'll find these in the really good. We've got red currants, white currants, pink currants, black currants, and then hybrids between the currants and the gooseberries, which are in the same genus, known as Yasta berries. I'm a big fan of the Yasta berry. I'm a big fan of some of the more cultivated gooseberries that don't have as large of thorns, like the Pixwell varieties. There's also ones with ornamental flowers, but those, as beautiful as they are typically less promising in terms of fruit production because they've been selected for their beautiful flowers, not for fruit. Cranberries, service berries, peaches, figs, sea berries, to experiment and to try things. I guess we'll end with this sea berry because we were talking about nitrogen fixation and talking about these multi-purpose species. This is a pioneer nitrogen fixer. Another one that, like dessert quality fruit, is pretty marginal or subjective. They're very bitter. They taste like medicine, and they do in fact have these incredible compounds that in fact in Eastern Europe and then now is actually really common. Like most of your high-end shampoos and things like that are containing sea berry. It's a major crop in China. The Russian cosmonauts are being sent into space with like dried sea berries, sea berry seed extract, which is really important part of their nutritional profile. And then the Latin is literally translates as shiny horse, hippophae. Which is something apparently they've long observed in terms of like coat quality. I'll stop with that, and I guess we'll open to questions. There's a couple species I hope to address, so if there's something you wanted to hear about, but let me just note, it's not an accident that I'm a fan of things like figs, cherries, and peaches, but skipped them because while they're incredible and delicious, they are really difficult, and not one that I generally typically recommend against, other than experimenting with or having a few to, for yourself. But they're very, very finicky trees, with the one exception in the case of cherries of the North Star cherry, which I'm finding as a quote unquote pie cherry or sour cherry is actually, given proper pruning, light, and air, growing just as nice of the cherries as the quote unquote dessert we can do, but they're really just not that happy. They're I'd put them in the category of very difficult in terms of the potential for pest, disease, or just trees that grow and establish and then suddenly die. Okay.
Great.
Questions?
So Chadley is going to read some questions out loud to you. We have like maybe 5 minutes.
Okay, thanks so much. Yeah, the next session starts at 11:30, so we just want to make sure to get out of here and leave everybody enough time.
Okay.
I will, what just happened on my screen here?
Oh.
Okay, let me go back. Oh, thank you, Keith, for coming back on video.
Yeah.
Okay, so the first question you may have answered a lot in your ensuing workshop. So I'll read 2 questions first. But the first question was, do you have a list of all of the fruits and nuts you're growing on your farm? And that's asked by Bill. And then I'm going to ask.
Not readily available. But however, if you were to go to my website, you could see what we offer for nursery plants. And actually, we have a separate website for the nursery sales, and it's not a separate website, but a separate domain name for that, which is agroforestrynursery.com. And that's not yet updated for my 2021 offerings. And in the search bar, if you type plant sale or results with like every plant sale that we've had for the past 10 years or so, that gives a pretty comprehensive list of at least what we propagate for sale. I don't have a list of everything we grow, and we start looking at medicinal herbs and other like experiments, and we're well over like 350, 400 species. So I probably should compile that, but it's also a lot to digest. Not able to see the chat until now.
Okay.
So I apologize for
yeah, no problem. All right. So the next question, Keith, thank you, is from Hannah. She says, what's the easiest way to harvest and process the walnuts? Or do you just have them for lumber and ecological reasons?
Yeah. So with the black walnut, you do have like this perfect sphere that falls out of the tree naturally. You can shake the tree or climb the tree, but they really don't, once they're ripe, they fall. You can put a tarp down or something to make it easy to that. So they have the fruit, and then inside of the fruit, there's the shell. It's actually, it's almost like, it's nice to think of them as like a peach with a peach pit inside, which in fact is what an almond is, believe it or not. It's a peach with a peach pit. And then that's why an almond shell looks like a peach pit. But that fruit is actually that's the source of ink, and that's the source of juglone as usually used by itself. I mostly harvest walnuts for planting them again, so I can just let that stuff kind of naturally rot, and then I have these nice stratified walnuts by planting them in the fall in a squirrel protected bed. For eating them, what folks do is they will put all of those walnuts like under a big piece of plywood and then drive a vehicle over that. Is, while it's medicinal and the source of ink, it's the source of ink because it will stain your hands with like an iodine for weeks. So that's one reason why people don't do a lot of like management, like hands-on management with that. It depends on your scale. And then in terms of harvest, there's also things called nut whizzers, which are like big giant egg beating whisks that open they pick the nuts right off the ground, like in a big rolling. But yeah, I'd say maybe the point of the question was like how to get in that fruit. And yeah, big piece of plywood. You can do it one by one with a hammer or a vise. But yeah, a bunch of them in a pile, piece of plywood over it, like drive a car or tractor right over it, and you'll have them cracked, the fruits cracked.
Okay, thank you. Tim asks, is there an updated zone hardiness chart since 2006? Sorry, missed hearing what was available today.
That 2006 one was sourced from the Arbor Day organization. And it's neat. There's this whole story about how that was created during the Bush administration. And they basically like commissioned a new hardiness map and found it to be so such objective evidence on behalf of climate change that they re-averaged it to the 1800s, because at the time the administration was officially denying climate change, and then generated some of the most significant evidence of climate change in the they basically like re-averaged it with 1800s weather station data. So the Arbor Day organization is definitely one of the tree planting oriented organizations that's tracking climate change. That said, I find that they're almost exaggerating it on behalf of selling people marginally hardy trees. They really want to sell people, they want to sell more trees to more of the country. And like there's a little bit of an asterisk to that, in that, you know, they're going to say, oh, you're fine to plant peaches in northern New Hampshire, whereas like I have had my first peaches and I was like, this is amazing. I'm gonna have successful peach trees eventually died with test winters. And I was like, there's probably something to the fact that all these old timers say you can't grow peaches in Vermont. That said, in downtown, they survive better with like a windbreak and buildings. So Arbor Day would be the first place I'd look. I'm sorry, I don't know of like a 2020 update.
All right. Thank you very.
Do you mind if I stop sharing your screen before we go on to the next question? Okay.
Okay. All right. So I think we have time for one more question here, and then we'll turn it back over to Laura real quick. This question is from Amy, Keith. She says, during non-pandemic years, do you have a volunteer work or learning exchange program at your farm?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for asking. We do. We formerly experimented with kind of formal operation where we had like different positions that people were applying to. And we've realized that it comes to a case-by-case basis to develop like mutually beneficial learning relationships. We do run a 2-week residential course that we actually pulled off last year. We did it with a maximum of 10 participants, everyone pre-quarantined, and then with a 2-week intensive, we basically co-quarantined together with the knowledge that if something was to show up, we at least like had that knowledge in our pod before we went back out into the world. So we hope to do that again. Weekend and week-long workshops, which we're still on the fence about how we might do. We're looking at trying to do both a pruning workshop and a grafting workshop in like a socially distanced way, where everybody in the group is 6 feet apart and masked, and we don't have the type of, you know, intimacy that we end up with in the 2-week intensive, where there's really no hope of staying isolated.
Great, thank you.
So yes.
Awesome. All right. So
yeah, if that's it for questions, I guess I just wanted to thank everybody. Or I'm done anyway. Bye.
Thank you very much. Oops, there we go. Sorry about that. So Keith, thank you for your time and for sharing your knowledge with us. And thank you everyone for your great questions and engagement. Just a few announcements. NOFA is excited to be celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. And if you're not already a member, we'd love for you to join our growing community in 2021. And we do have scholarship memberships available. So you can contact us for more information if you're interested in that. Join us at 12:30 today for our annual meeting and working lunch. We'll be holding a raffle for all meeting attendees. Also, please check out our virtual exhibitor fair, including our book list hosted by Main Street Bookends, where you can get copies of the books by our author speakers and others. And 20% of the proceeds will go back to support NOFA New Hampshire throughout the year. And we're looking forward to our next workshop, Agricultural Justice, Creating a Fair Farm, with Liz Henderson. That's next at 11:30, and we hope to see you there. And a link to get to that session should be in the chat. So thank you for spending your morning with us, and take care. And thank you again, Keith.
No problem. Yeah, thanks everybody. Thanks NOFA. Thanks moderators. Thanks everybody who tuned in.